Do you want to switch this over? Okay. Professor Timothy Wilson, who's a Professor Emeritus of Arts of the Renaissance in the University of Oxford. From 1980 to 1990, he was assistant keeper of the Renaissance collections at the British Museum, and from 1990 to 2017 was keeper of Western art at the Ashmolean Museum in the University of Oxford, where he is now an honorary curator. He's a specialist in Italian Renaissance Maiolica and has published major Maiolica collections in London, Oxford, New York, Vienna, and elsewhere, and just has a new book out as well, which is a very beautiful book. His interest in Spanish lustreware is particularly in connection to its relationship to Italy, as we've just been discussing. So he's going to go into many of the themes that I've already talked about, but we'll hear more about it from the British Museum side. So thank you very much, Tim.
Mariam is the great specialist for us in these matters in England, and I'm very grateful to her for her part in bringing this day together and bringing me back to this wonderful city, the heartland of lustreware for much of the world. The task that was set me is to present the Valencian lustreware in two English collections, the British Museum and the Ashmolean Museum, which is a department of Oxford University. I worked, as Mariam said, at the British Museum from 1980 to 1990 and at the Ashmolean from 1990 to 2017, so I know both collections firsthand, though neither is strong in the glorious lustreware of the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada. The British Museum is one of the best collections in the world of Valencian lustreware. The Ashmolean, smaller, but still interesting. Both are creations of Victorian England, with roots in the years immediately after the London Great Exhibition of 1851. You will forgive me, Mariam and I did not put our heads together before these talks, and so some of the things that I will be saying she has already touched upon, but I was happy to see that there is almost no contradiction, even if there may be duplication. My own specialist interests have long been focused on Italy more than on Spain, and I'm not well informed about the archaeological evidence for Valencian lustreware, nor do I have any expertise in Spanish heraldry. I cannot speak with any authority about what is late Malaga and what is early Valencian, nor can I distinguish, and I think I could look at these objects for 1,000 years and still be unable to distinguish between Paterna and Meneses. I shall therefore say little about chronology or about attribution, but will concentrate instead on how these two collections came into being in the context of developing knowledge in mid-19th century France and England about what we now call Hispano-Moresque lustreware. Nearly all the pieces that I shall show you are 15th century or early 16th century Valencian, and I guess the greater part were made in Meneses. A separate lecture might deal with tiles, and I shall touch on them only in passing. Nowadays, historians and art historians in our universities are enjoined not to focus too much on dead white men, but regardless, here are the four heroes of my story. On the left, Augustus Wollaston Franks was appointed assistant in the British Museum department that came to be called British and Medieval in 1851, so a couple of years earlier than the beginnings of what is now the V&A, which Mariam was talking about. Wealthy himself, and with a superb eye, he essentially created, between 1851 and his death in 1897, the British Museum's collections of European decorative arts. John Charles Robinson, about whom we've heard already this morning, another brilliant connoisseur, was trained as an artist, and in 1852 was appointed the first curator of the Museum of Ornamental Art at Marlborough House, which had been set up, as Mariam told us, after the Great Exhibition, to provide models of good design to improve the calibre of British industrial design, which, as I read the press coverings, the Great Exhibition was felt to have shown to be deplorably inferior to French industrial design, and nothing provokes British politicians as much as a feeling that the French are doing things better. But, as we will see, the French did do quite a lot of this better than the British. Moving across, Charles Drury Edward Fortnum, who wasn't rich himself, but married money from the Fortnum and Mason's grocery business in Piccadilly. He actually married 2 successive heiresses to the Fortnum and Mason's grocery business, which is very strategic marrying to keep money in the family. He was a collector of sculpture and decorative arts, those collecting areas that were becoming so fashionable in England in the 1850s. He never had a museum job, but in 1873, as we heard from Marian, published the monumental catalogue of Maiolica, including Hispano-Moresque, for the South Kensington. He later lost confidence in South Kensington management, and though he hadn't been a student at Oxford University himself, he became the major benefactor of the Ashmolean Museum, which, as I say, is a department of Oxford University, to which he gave and bequeathed most of his art collections. These 3 are notable not only for the collections they built, but also for their contributions in the same period, particularly in the early 1850s, to the understanding in England of what Spanish lustreware is and what it is not. On the right is Frederick Duquesne Godman. He was younger than the other 3 and was primarily an eminent student of natural history. Alongside this, and we have very little documentation of his motivation, he created astonishing collections of Islamic and Spanish pottery, which came to the British Museum in 1983, 64 years after his death. On arrival at the British Museum, Franks, with useful verve, lost no time in launching collections of European ceramics, an area in which the museum had not previously been active. These are his first 2 purchases from London dealers in June 1852. It's no coincidence that both are armorial. The idea already then, but as Mariam told us, much enhanced in the Bernal sale 3 years later, the idea was that the museum as a historical, the Victorian expression was an archaeological collection, should focus on objects of documentary and historical value. In Italian Maiolica, which Franks had started acquiring the previous year in 1851, and which was always more important to the British Museum, this meant seeking out signed, marked, and dated pieces. Since these are vanishingly rare in Spanish lustreware, heraldic pieces constituted the most documentary objects in this field available. In the same spirit is this dish with Castile over Leon impaling Aragon, which Franks bought a few months later from another London dealer. The new Museum of Ornamental Art at Marlborough House, now under the dynamic leadership of Robinson, also made its first purchases around this time, just a few months later than the first purchases for the British Museum. And in 1855, a momentous opportunity occurred for both museums. Ralph Bernal, who'd assembled one of the finest collections of medieval and later works of art ever put together in England. Indeed, as Mariam said, the only one that really rivaled the great collections of people like Pio and above all de Bruges-Duménil. And he died in 1854. An attempt was made under the leadership of the Society of Arts, which was very much patronized by Prince Albert, who was interested in such things. An attempt was made to persuade the British government to buy the collection as a whole, but this failed, and instead Treasury grants were given to both museums to buy at the sale. The South Kensington Museum had a larger grant and bought more objects, but in some ways the British Museum was able to pull rank as the senior institution, and Robinson wrote rather sadly after the sale to his boss Cole, saying, "I have always, following your instructions, I have always ceded to the British Museum, and our losses in that area have been somewhat perplexing." Purchases at the Bernal sale are still the bedrock of the collections of European decorative arts, especially Italian maiolica, of both the British Museum and the V&A. So these are the British Museum bought 5 pieces of Hispano-Moresque, I shall continue to use the word, but 69 pieces of the more sought-after Italian maiolica. And here they are. We'll come back to the one top left. The one top right is one of the first we'll see with the arms of Florentine families. These are the Zati of Florence. In 1857, staying with the armorial theme, another piece was made for an identifiable Tuscan family was bought. This time, these are the arms of the Spanocchi of Siena. This was bought from the English collector Thomas Adolphus Trollope in Florence, one of the literary and artistic English community that was rapidly developing in Florence, and was no doubt helpful to English museum curators trying to acquire works of art in Florence. I'll come back to the service, the Spanocchi service, a bit later. In the 1860s and 70s, the politics of the British Museum made it more difficult for Franks to buy maiolica or Hispano-Moresque, but this was compensated for by Franks's talent for friendship. His bachelor friend, John Henderson, who had lived in a house adjoining the museum, bequeathed in 1878 his extensive collections of European, Islamic and Chinese works of art, and his 21 examples of Hispano-Moresque, of which you can see 5 here, more than doubled the museum's holdings. This, I think, is my favorite piece in the entire British Museum collection, artistically speaking, not historically speaking, which was given by Franks himself to the museum rather later in 1885. In 1892, this plate on the left was given by Frederick Duquesne Godman, a museum trustee whom we've already met, again playing to the idea that the British Museum was an appropriate home for pieces of historic interest. The arms are those of Medici of Florence, with the tiara of the papacy above and the cryptic motto Glovis below. This is a motto used by Pope Leo X, and the references to him, he was Pope from 1513 to 1521. And the plate is likely to have been made for him. A dish in the museum at Bologna and a jug in Arezzo are from the same set. Godman had serious money from his family's holdings in the Whitbread Company, for many years the largest brewery in the world. From about 1865, he started energetically building his collections of Islamic ceramics, including Valencian lustreware. He died in 1919, but not till 1983, under the will of his daughter Edith, did the collection come to the museum, as he had himself wished, in lieu of inheritance tax, this wonderful system that exists in the United Kingdom, to which we owe so many of our major museum acquisitions in the last 50 years. The 107 pieces of Valencian lustreware in the Godman bequest include some of the most celebrated examples anywhere. The most iconic piece in the Godman collection is this vase. We've already seen the type, with wing handles in the tradition of the great vases of the Alhambra. The arms are those of a version of Medici of Florence, with, in the upper roundel, on the left you should be able to see, the 3 fleurs-de-lis, which were granted to the Medici family in 1465 by the King of France, specifically to Piero de' Medici, known as the Gauti. The emblem, I hope that will not test the translator too much. The emblem of a diamond ring, signifying fidelity, was used by Piero, with the feathers, I should say, was used by Piero de' Medici, and after his death in 1470, by his son Lorenzo the Magnificent, charismatic ruler of late 15th century Florence and protagonist in much of its cultural brilliance. Lorenzo is recorded in correspondence to have been interested in ceramics and new ceramics especially. So I think it likely the vase was commissioned by or for him. In 1700, an armorial jar, which sounds like this one, was recorded in the Grand Ducal Guardaroba in Florence, the Medici Grand Ducal storerooms, but by 1774 it had been sold by the Grand Duke and acquired by the flamboyant English collector Horace Walpole for his neo-Gothic house, Strawberry Hill. At the Strawberry Hill sale, long after Walpole's death, in 1842, it was acquired by the immensely rich China merchant Hollingworth Maniac for 21 guineas, that's about £22. 50 years later, it was sold at the Maniac sale for 670 guineas, so that's a 30-fold increase in price, and bought by Godman. I've said I do not profess to be able to distinguish Manises from Paterna, but I note that though the Godman vase has usually been attributed, including by me, to Manises, one strikingly similar in form is in the museum at Paterna, top right, presumably excavated there, but perhaps my local colleagues can throw light on whether that proves decisive evidence that lustered vases exactly of this type were made in Paterna as well as in Manises. Another spectacular example, as far as I know unique in form, is this pair of jars with the arms of another plutocratic Florentine merchant family, the Gondi. Marco Spallanzani, in his wonderful book on Hispano-Moresque for Florentine clients, which Mariam mentioned earlier, suggests this may have been part of a large delivery documented in archives from Valencia to the Gondi in 1487. I should add here that the documentation that Marco publishes is extraordinarily vivid, showing that services of lustreware made in Manises were packed into enormous jars, hundreds at a time, and shipped over from Valencia to Florence, and in this case to the Gondi. And here are more examples of lustreware from the Godman collection made for Florentine clients. I hope you can read the names of the families which I've captioned them with. Bottom left is another version of the Medici arms, this time for the branch descended from Vieri de' Medici. And more lustreware from the Godman bequest. And 3 more pieces of Valencian lustreware from the Godman bequest with Christian inscriptions. The one on the left says Ave Maria Gratia Plena. Before leaving Godman, I want to point out how unusual it was in the 19th century to collect Hispano-Moresque alongside other Islamic, notably Iznik and Persian in Godman's case, wares. The earlier tradition of collecting Hispano-Moresque alongside usually larger groups of Italian Maiolica remained strong into the 20th century. For instance, one of the best of all collections, that held by the cloisters in New York, was bought en bloc in 1956 from the estate of the newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst, the original Citizen Kane of Orson Welles' film of 1941, whose vast collections included lots of Italian maiolica and many other works of decorative art, but not significant ceramics from the Islamic world. Among other donors to the British Museum, I should mention in this place the great scholar and collector G.J. de Osma, founder of the Instituto de Valencia de Don Juan in Madrid. He'd been the first Spaniard ever to study at Oxford and kept close links with England, and he gave groups of Spanish tiles to the museum in the 1890s and later. Lastly, I should point out that though the British Museum is not a systematic national repository for archaeological finds, which are for the most part kept in local museums, some finds from southern ports have come to the museum over the years. In the centre is a large plate from Bristol, which may be the most spectacular archaeological find of its type from anywhere in England. On the left, you need to look at this a little carefully, a complete plate reconstructed from fragments found in a cesspit in Poole. A notable thing about this for me is the way the luster, but not the blue, has been eaten away over most of the fragments, presumably from acidity in the cesspit, but one fragment, it's perhaps easier to see on the back, was somehow shielded from the acidity and has preserved its luster front and back. The British newspapers nowadays are constantly asking of politicians is, who knew what when? Knowledge about Hispano-Moresque pottery in France and England was moving fast in the middle of the 19th century, and I want to track this with reference to two of the pieces we've already seen. The Medici vase, when at Strawberry Hill, was listed by Horace Walpole in 1774 as a large vase of Florentine faience with the arms of the great Duke. Walpole, who knew a lot about genealogy, was right in identifying the arms of those as those of the Medici, though the date of the vase is long before the family assumed the title of Grand Dukes. He was, of course, quite wrong in thinking it made of Florentine faience. The attribution to Italy was still current at the time of the Strawberry Hill sale in 1842. You may be able to see at the bottom, wonderful title page. I wish all sale catalogues had title pages as good as this. But you can see at the bottom the description, an extraordinary fine specimen of the Raphael or Faenza ware with the arms of the great Duke, of singular design and presenting a curious and very fine specimen of this much prized work. So, at this date in England, collectors were unable to distinguish between Italian and Spanish products. The confusion was compounded by the recent provenance of many examples of Valencian lustreware to Italy, as the well-travelled Robinson noted in 1856. One very remarkable fact is that though the Hispano-Arab pieces are still commonly enough to be met with in Italy, Sicily, and on the Istrian and Dalmatian coast, to all appearances they are almost entirely wanting in Spain, the land of their production, and how far this was true, Mariam has already discussed. In 1861, Robinson catalogued the Medici vase in his catalogue of the Magnac collection. He discussed the evidence and concluded, as he had done 5 years before in cataloguing the vase in the Soulage collection, which Mariam talked about, but he concluded still cautiously that the present piece, therefore, would seem to have been manufactured in Spain or one of its dependent islands in the Mediterranean, either expressly for the Medici family or at all events for exportation to Italy. French savants were more advanced than their English counterparts in distinguishing Spanish products from Italian. In 1847, the French art historian Jules Labat had published a catalogue of the rich collections formed by Louis-Fidèle de Bruges-Duménil. In the introduction, he wrote, "Hispano-Arab pottery has been little known for a long time and confused with Italian maiolica, which is a mere imitation of it. But since archaeology has extended its scope to objects of private life, these very curious products have been restored to the Hispano-Arab workshops to which they belong. Monsieur Rieucre, the knowledgeable curator of the Ceramic Museum at Sèvres, was the first to bring them back to light. And this is the book referred to. This is the catalogue of the Sèvres Museum, published 2 years previously, in 1845, in which Rieucre had written, these plates of the sort that are in the middle, centre left of the plate on the right, these plates, which apart from their Moresque ornament, combine the characteristics of Arab manufacture, come without doubt from the workshops established by the Moors in Spain at the time of their domination, and carried on until the time of their complete expulsion by Philip III in 1610. This account, of course, is essentially correct, though it does not purport to allocate production to specific regions of Spain. And from this time on, French writers were aware of the Spanish origin of many items that had previously been supposed to be Italian. And here we are back with the Santa Catalina dish. The sale in Paris in 1847, catalogue on the right, of the first collection assembled by the connoisseur and writer Eugène Pillot, consisted in good part of objects he'd acquired on a long trip to Italy in 1846. Included was this lovely plate inscribed Santa Catalina Guarda Nos. It looks rather like Italian, but I think is actually Spanish. Catalina in particular. It was Catalan. It was, as you could, so Valencian. So it was, as you can see from the manuscript annotation in the bottom right slide, bought by Isaac. Now, Isaac is the London dealer John Coleman Isaac, one of a network of Jewish dealers in London who sold to Ralph Bernal. And it was correctly described in the Pillot sale as Spanish, and this was followed in the Bernal sale, though so uncertain was knowledge of the subject in England in 1855, at the time of the Bernal sale, that the other Bernal pieces, which the British Museum acquired, were not attributed to Spain, but catalogued by Christie's in a section headed Faenza and Raphael ware being the current English expression for Italian historiato maiolica. So one can trace in British Museum documentation Franks's realization that what we now know to be Valencian lustreware was indeed Spanish. The first indication I have found was that he registered the dish that he'd bought for the museum in 1853, which has the arms of Castile, Leon and Aragon, as Spanish. The arms make that relatively easy. With some others, notably ones he recognized as having Italian family arms, he was more equivocal and added a question mark in the museum register. But in his annotations, in his own copy of the 1855 Bernal catalogue, he rightly describes all the British Museum's purchases as Spanish. So Franks's recognition of Spanish lustreware as a separate category from Italian, somewhat tardy in comparison with French experts. I think Mariam gave rather too much credit to the Brits in this respect, was exactly coeval with the launch of the British Museum's collections of this ware in the years 1852 to 55, and indeed South Kensington's. Only with Robinson's catalogue of the Soulage collection in 1856, and crucially for general knowledge, the second edition of Joseph Marryat's History of Pottery and Porcelain, which you see on the screen, widely recognised in England. Marryat, who called it Hispano-Arabic, included engravings, which you can see, of some of the British Museum's acquisitions, which are among the first illustrations of Hispano-Moresque pottery to be published anywhere in English. The French remained ahead in the study of the subject. In a footnote to the Magnac catalogue in 1861, Robinson noted with admiration the very recent then publication of Charles d'Avilliers' Histoire des faïences hispano-mauresques, un reflet métallique. D'Avilliers' well-documented study clarified the role of the Valencian factories for the first time. I'm open to correction if Spanish scholars had got to this point earlier than the French. And this led to the general adoption of the term Hispano-Mauresque in preference to terms like Hispano-Arabic, which had been used before. And this marks the beginning of modern international scholarship on Valencian lustreware. Meanwhile, Fortnum, from 1854, private collector, of course, not associated with any museum, had also in a modest way begun buying. At first, he called his pieces Moresco wares. Then by 1857, he had adopted the term Hispano-Mauresque. So this great big lustered dish was acquired by Fortnum in 1856, curiously, from a dealer called Pickett near Nuremberg. So it was very much a European market, but it's likely, I suspect, that Pickett had acquired it in Italy. In 1856, Fortnum bought these two plates, which he was particularly delighted with, because he thought the symbols on the back to be a pottery mark, which he rightly thought a great rarity. Whether they are a pottery mark or whether they are some kind of good luck sign, I'm sure my local colleagues may be able to tell me. And these are more pieces from the Fortnum collection, which formed part of his gift to the Ashmolean Museum, which he had now become a supporter of in 1888. The one on the left is particularly interesting and, as far as I know, unique, but I open to correction because of the Christian symbolism of the three interlaced fishes on the back, an emblem, of course, of the Trinity. The collection, after Fortnum's death, continued to grow in bits and pieces. Among donors to the Ashmolean was Gerald Reitlinger, the author of the monumental study of the art market, which many of you will know, The Economics of Taste. And here are two more acquisitions. The one on the left of a well-known type, meticulously represented by Hugo van der Goes in the 1470s in his great altarpiece made in Bruges for the Florentine merchant Tommaso Portinari, now in the Uffizi. On the right, not of course lustreware, but I think Valencian, and I suppose Paterna, but I remain to be corrected, given by Reitlinger again. In my own time as keeper, I was able to round out the Ashmolean collection somewhat, though it is still far from comprehensive or even representative. I was particularly keen to document the crucial trade in pottery between Valencia and Tuscany, so was pleased when able to acquire this plate from an English country dealer. This plate. The arms, which we saw earlier on a small plate at the British Museum, are of two great Sienese families, Piccolomini impaling Spanocchi, being the arms granted to Ambrogio Spanocchi of Siena and his family by Pope Pius II, Piccolomini, also Sienese. And these arms, with this impalement of Piccolomini and Spanocchi, were used by subsequent generations of the successful Sienese banking family. You may be able to see, intriguingly, that the blue colour on the boss on the left has run in firing, in second firing, but rather, I'm open to correction as to levels of firing, but rather than scrap this plate onto which so much work had gone to create the relief patterns, they proceeded to lustre and fire it. So with the help of kind friends, the Ashmolean has almost no money for buying things, I was able to raise £10,000 for this purchase. But the timing was fortunate, because not long afterwards, Middle Eastern buyers encouraged by the great auction houses, started to take more of an interest in Hispano-Moresque as being a form of Islamic art, and international market prices rose very sharply. At Christie's in New York in 2023, a plate from the same set, the one on your right, very slightly larger than the Ashmolean's one, fetched $352,000. So my £10,000 looks quite a good buy. For many of us in the English-speaking world, the V&A catalogue, Spanish pottery 1248 to 1898 by Anthony Ray, is something of a Bible on the subject. The catalogue is an astonishing achievement for someone whose career was as a schoolmaster, not a professional art historian, who only became intensely interested in Spanish pottery on retirement. In the years before his death in 2009, he lived in Oxford, and the museum and I benefited greatly from his knowledge and his generosity, particularly in tiles. The tile there's Anthony at St. Peter's in Rome at the top. The tile on the left, inscribed Ab Saviesa with knowledge, is said to be from the cell of St. Vincent Ferrer in the convent of Santo Domingo here in Valencia. Does the convent still exist? The tile on the right was associated by González Martí with correspondence from 1494 between Juan, Duke of Gandia, son of the Valencian Borgia Pope, Alexander VI, and his father, the Pope. Juan reported that he'd had made in Gandia tiles with the arms and devices of Your Holiness, and that he thought them more successful than ones made in Manises. Tiles of this pattern were laid in the papal fortress in Rome, the Castel Sant'Angelo. The relief moulded tile in the middle with the Medici diamond ring, which was given by Anthony, was also made for Castel Sant'Angelo under the papacy of Pope Leo X. González Martí, to me rather strangely, thought these tiles were Valencian, but in fact I think it has been subsequently proved that they were made in the workshop of Nicoloso Pisano at Triana, over the river from Seville. I conclude with the Ashmoleans' most recent acquisition, a lusted vase made last year by Arturo Mora Benavent in Manises, who some of us will be meeting tomorrow. It's a source of real pleasure to see the great tradition of Manises so skillfully and passionately revived by this marvellous artist. Thank you.
We're going to take some questions now. If anyone has a particular question for Tim. Will we still have time for kind of a discussion after? Okay, so you can ask now or keep your question for a bit later. I wanted to ask you about the spinocchi dishes and the moulding. Maybe Jaume can help with this as well. The moulded designs around the rims of those lusted dishes made for the Spinocchi family.
I don't think
they seem to be very unusual. Can we go? The moulded designs on those dishes.
I don't think they're moulded. I think they're appliqué.
Oh well.
Well, there is a production of the first years of the 16th century, and I don't know if there's any kind of record.
But it's a very unusual type of additional decoration for. No. Okay, it's typical for the 16th century.
It's more rich than normal, no?
Yeah. Okay.
But it's not unusual.
Okay.
They are copying, I guess, the production of Germany in
brass,
maybe brass or gilded.
I see. Okay.
Servers.
Thank you. Yeah, to me they're very odd.
Mariam, you talked about a second luster firing. Aren't these things 3 times fired?
So there's Jaume knows better than anyone the production here. I don't want to talk. There's a biscuit firing, glaze firing.
Third firing.
3 firing.
First is only the clay.
Yeah.
The second is with the thin glaze and the blue. And the third is the luster.
So
Yeah.
my plate on the left up here, that blue must have run in second firing.
In
Yeah.
second firing.
Yeah,
So
you're right.
that's strange, because normally when an object comes from the kill in this condition is rejected. No? So
They'd spent so much
it's a waste.
on applying the
With
relief
the
decoration.
decoration. Yeah, you're right.
Maybe they remake the painting of the coat of arms on this. Maybe this is
And the other thing, of course, is that you can always get some blue paint and paint over where it's gone wrong, and that will only become clear 30 years later.
Yeah.
Well, you put something over the top, like a ewer.
But of course,
So
these
you hide it,
bosses
yeah.
are in imitation
Yeah.
of the enamelled bosses in the centre of silver and brass dishes.
Yeah. There's a question from Pepe.
Y también latón. I don't know whether you can see that well, but the plate on the left includes blue and purple. Microphone, please, or else the interpreters cannot hear and thus cannot translate. Yes, but maybe when this was painted, it just was smeared. But this is not infrequent. This was used on certain occasions to identify this with red in heraldian terms.
Manganese is routinely used for heraldic reds in Italian Maiolica, and I think occasionally in Valencian lustreware too. Manganese, of course, depending on the firing conditions, can come out sort of dark brown, almost black, or if you're lucky, it comes out as a purple that is quite red. But I should say also that as somebody who has spent a long time looking at Italian lustreware and is very aware of what Cipriano Piccolpasso wrote about this in the 1550s, that Piccolpasso says of 100 pieces that go in the kiln, only 10 come out good. So the failure rate for luster in Italy was really quite high, when failure not means complete failure, but things haven't come out brilliantly iridescent. Whereas the success rate, the competence of the plotters in Manises is just, it seemed to me, unparalleled in world history. I mean, almost never have I seen something that is really badly fired from 15th century Valencia.
Have you been encountering failures in the excavations?
Yeah, but have this in Manises, in the north of Manises, there is the Baixada del Molí. That's the way to Paterna. It's in front, the other side of the river, up north. So in this part of the town, there are millions of wasters of mainly luster. So that means that the luster waste was
Third firing. Losses. Okay.
Yeah. But in this area, there is mainly only luster, and it's millions of fragments.
Wow.
So that's the problem of the lusterware.
And these are failed. They haven't just broken.
Probably.
The luster firing.
Yeah. It's failed being making the pot.
That's fascinating. Thank you. Okay. Question.
Hola.
Good morning. Rather than a question, I have a remark that I would like to share. In view of the great collections, it goes without saying that what was manufactured in Manises was for export purposes, for sales, and there's very few objects, and there are very few objects in Manises in comparison for sale back in the time. And to piggyback on what Jaume has mentioned, there are numerous fragments, shards that were rejected that were recovered, but can tell us the origin of many objects in the collections of which we know very little about. But when we obtain a fragment that was discarded back in the day because it was failed, but you can connect this with an object that is in perfect mint condition in your museums. So these two things can help archaeology where it can help. And Jaume knows this firsthand because he found not long ago pieces that corroborate the ownership of objects, manises that could have been questioned. Para nosotros esto es muy importante e interesante. La verdad es que querríamos saber más al respecto, desde luego. Okay, I would like to go back on the molding on these plates, and except for the central one, which is frequent in manises, that in the all has never been seen in Valencia or in manises. Are you talking about the fragments? Yes, and the sites of 100 archaeology interventions in manises. Never have we seen this kind of molding. So you think this was manufactured elsewhere? No, I'm saying it is an exceptional object.
Well, the one on the right, the one that was at Christie's, is very large indeed. I haven't got the dimensions, but it's exceptionally large. It's 42, 45 centimetres.
It's a very special commission, and yeah.
Well, the Spanocchi had a lot of money.
Okay.
And perhaps we can go back to the question on how both museums collected, and how did they decide who collects what?
Well, me?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
I think the 1852 and 1853 purchases that Franks made for the British Museum, so before the Bernal sale, were all armorial. So I think that there was already there in the British Museum the idea that the British Museum was after documents. And indeed, when asking the Treasury for money at the Bernal sale, Franks, the Robinson and Cole said for South Kensington, these are provide wonderful opportunities for information and inspiration to our manufacturers. And Franks wrote, these objects, the objects of interest, are a collection of documents, and he compared them to Greek pottery in relationship to Greek civilization, which of course was already an active collecting area for the British Museum. So I think the notion of the British Museum as an archaeological collection was already current in 1852 and 1853, but it was the arrival a couple of years later than Franks of South Kensington on the scene that forced the two museums, partly to avoid losing the confidence of the Treasury, to accentuate their different missions, and those different missions are very clearly set out. It's even clearer for Italian Maiolica in their purchases from the Bernal sale. This has continued. I mean, when I was at the British Museum, had vigorous debates, not with my colleagues in ceramics, but my colleagues in metalwork, as to whether a certain object which was heraldic or historical, and thus, in my view, appropriate for the British Museum to seek to acquire, or an example of metalwork which the V&A curators were interested in, that there was an element of needle in that, even 120 years after the Bernal sale.
Yeah, I think because the funding is coming to both institutions from the government, central government, which is not so much the case anymore because we have very little money for acquisition now, in order not to be bidding against each other or to be, in conflict with each other, there had to be this decision sort of about collecting priorities, and as Tim says, I think that remains the case to this day. So the V&A would be more inclined to collect something that has sort of aesthetic value rather than historical value, or is important for sort of how explaining the techniques and processes of how you make something. We're still very much a museum that focuses on the making process and the design process. So I'd say that's still the case today.
And your relationship with makers
exactly.
is a great example of that.
That's true. We still work very closely with, I suppose the V&A since the 19th century has worked on collecting contemporary art. So, you know, today we still work with people who are artists and at the forefront. You know, it's less possible for us to collect their work perhaps, but we do a lot of collaborations and fellowships and programming around contemporary art and design.
But I think the simple answer to the question is that in 1855 it was politically expedient for the British Museum and the V&A to pretend to the government that they were doing entirely different things, though really they weren't doing such different things.
Is it time to move on to our next speaker? Thank you very much. Should we have another round of applause for Tim?